بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. حضورنا الكرام، للاستماع إلى الترجمة الفورية باللغة العربية يرجى اختيار اللغة الألمانية من الشريط الأسفل. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On behalf of all the staff of Bankruptcy Commission and on behalf of our guest speakers from Ronald Berger, I would like to welcome you all to this symposium. This symposium is complementary to the Bankruptcy Commission's effort to raise the efficiency of the bankruptcy procedures and to enable the implementation of the law, as well as to promote the effective implementation of the provisions and find solutions for business practices. First, I would like to introduce our speakers. Mr. René Sager, who is the Managing Partner at Ronald Berger Middle East, Mr. Sassan Hatem, who is the Partner at Ronald Berger Middle East, Mr. Saeed Al-Sayed, who is the Senior Project Manager at Ronald Berger Middle East. During the symposium, our speakers will address several topics such as how to root out threats in your business model, symptoms of crisis, corporate governance during a restructuring. Our dearest audience, we would like to remind you that you can write your questions on the Q&A button below. The speakers will answer your question at the end of the presentation. Now it is my pleasure to call on first speaker, Mr. René Sager, to begin with his topic. As we are aware of time, we kindly ask that you do not exceed your time. The floor is yours, Mr. René.
Assalamu alaikum. It's a great privilege and honor to present to you hidden threats in your business model.
لكم موضوعا مهما جدا وخصوصا في هذه.
This has been a study I've been working on for 5 years, which is a amalgamation. It's a compilation of all the experiences which we have also as Roland Berger in our restructuring practice. Perhaps if you could have the next slide, please. This will be the kind of the agenda we will be kind of talking about. The first half an hour will be on how to identify and root out kind of threats which are in your company and which might not be seen very well because they're hidden. And there are ways to find the hidden threats which ultimately, when they open up, when they declare themselves, can cause problems, which we have found is really one of the root causes why companies go bankrupt. The sooner you identify them, the more freedom you will have to move and to basically fight them. The second part will be, what are the symptoms of a crisis? How will it basically concretely, how will you recognize them? And in the third half an hour, Saeed will go over what's the corporate governance kind of during a restructuring. How do you set up to take the measures effectively? Because it is a very different world and a very different business kind of going forward. The speakers, I have the privilege basically of starting here. Sassan will take over, and then Saeed will take basically you through the last part kind of in this. And you'll find that it is based on experience, which we will kind of bring to you, because the experience is in our firm. Our firm, Roland Berger, is based on a vast restructuring kind of experience around the globe. 50 offices, 24 employees, and with a very firm and solid footprint, basically in the GCC. From 2006 onward now, you see kind of the offices kind of where we are present, and you see basically the renowned companies we have worked for. Our competency for restructuring, for workouts, for helping companies to do the turnaround is over 10,000 cases. And that is the experience we all bring together and we all join. Now, it's always good to talk about yourself, but we did not want to keep this from you. If you ask our clients, that's on the right-hand side of this page, you see that there is a lot of experience on Roland Berger, which shows us that we can really have impact in reality, which I think is important. And we do that in very different sectors. Now, of course, tonight we will not talk about the specific sectors, but we will basically talk about kind of what are the insights which we derive from the cases which we do. Without further ado, let's jump into the content, which we would like kind of to talk about. It's Trojan horses of decline. And the research which we started and took 5 years was basically triggered by our experience that if you talk to management, often very successful management, find they're in a situation where the company is not doing well. And that opens up, that shows typically in a very short time span. And in that period, an incredible lot of value gets destructed. And if you ask management and saying, look, you have been very successful, but now business is going down the drain. What changed? What is it? Because you mastered your business and still you cannot turn around now. Those were the 35 cases which we kind of analyzed and researched kind of in depth. We comprised them and mirrored them with our database within Roland Berger, which are proprietary cases. And then we found a few interesting insights which we kind of would like to share. If we take the next page, please. The analogy is going to be about Troy, the Greek myth. You might be familiar with it. It was the Greek basically who attacked the Trojans, and the city, nobody had ever conquered the city. They left the horse with the Greek inside, and then they basically faked that they would have had left. The Trojans took the horse in, and then the Greek basically took the city. There was one other part of that myth which is less well known. There was a fortune teller. She was called Cassandra, according to the myth. And Cassandra was blessed with the ability to tell the future, but she was also cursed, according to the myth, because nobody would believe her. And she told the truth, but nobody followed her. And the idea, the analogy which we will show is that if you try to look things from a different angle, you can have the same insights as Cassandra, and you will be believed. So let's go to the next page. And how do we do this? First, we have to take a different view on only financial statements, because if we take cash flow, balance sheet, profit and loss, they might have indicators, but they don't pinpoint you to the root causes. They don't show you kind of the root causes. One of the real reasons, of course, is because they show you what has happened. They don't show the future, they show you history, kind of in this case. And therefore, we need to have a bit of a different view. And if we move to the next page, we will give you our view on if companies are in crisis. Now, on the graph on the left, you see that if we talk about crisis and insolvency, typically we talk about liquidity crisis. No money left to pay the bills. But we also know that liquidity crisis is preceded by an earnings crisis. You don't make enough money, not enough EBITDA, ultimately to sustain your business. But not making enough money is preceded by a strategic crisis, meaning you are not competitive enough and you don't differentiate enough on the market to make money. And if we look, whenever kind of the crisis is only in liquidity, at the end, you have very little room to maneuver. And the more early you identify the crisis, preferably in a strategic setting, you have much more kind of room to maneuver and to fight the crisis. Earnings crisis, liquidity crisis, that is typically 71% of the cases which you find, meaning that addressing the strategic crisis gets only done in a vast minority kind of the cases. Now, the relevance is on the right-hand side of this. We ran a survey and we asked of large companies and mid-sized companies, we asked the CEO, as in, from the moment you personally thought and were not fully convinced you could weather the crisis, until the moment you discussed it in your board of management, what was the time span? How long did it take you from mentally thinking, ooh, of thinking it was not fully in control, to discussing it on the agenda? And you see the results in the bar graph. You see that 57%, it took longer than a year for top management to discuss and share the feeling that something might be seriously wrong. Now, for those companies, you see that 12 months basically got wasted in all the room to maneuver. because the liquidity and the earnings crisis only grew bigger. We found that if you would address it in the first bucket, the 21 and the 22%, within 12 months of arriving really at the crisis, defined here as a liquidity crisis, 74% of the companies pulled out. So identifying early what is the strategic, what is the really root cause of earnings not being competitive or strategic, has profound impact on the sustainability and the continuity of your company. Now, if you go into literature, you will find that there's a lot of success stories on how to become successful. If you try to find why do companies fail, you find typically simple statistics, as in 21% management was inadequate, or you have found 11% fraud. You find 14% of not keeping up basically with IFRS regulations. But that's all aftermath. So we set out basically to find the root causes. What is it? If you could have the next page, please. And it starts with this very simple diagram. It starts with strategy formulation, thinking about the future. What are you going to do? How do you remain competitive? If we go from left to right, you find that first, you have to understand what's currently happening around me. Any strategic textbook will tell you this, and as a strategy consultant, we know it's true. Then you define your ambitions, and based on your ambitions, you define your business model. How are you going to make money? Is it going to be rental? Is it going to be sales? Is it going to be a franchise? Are you going to own everything? Is it going to be a leasing model? Anything can go. And then you start to prepare, you execute, and you continuously improve. Now let's consider the following, that if you would make a mistake somewhere in this process, for instance, the environment you operate in is so volatile, so fastly changing, that you have not taken that into account. As a consequence, your ambition will be off, and as a consequence, your business model will be wrong. There was a very large company, which was the biggest competitor of SAP. I think we all know SAP as the ERP system. There was one company who dominated the aviation industry. It was called Baan. Baan made one mistake. They thought they would have only the products which they make kind of customized only for the airline industry. And somebody said, we can sell that to other industries. So what they did is they started packaging standard modules for software from very bespoke, customized solutions for the airline industry. Different business model, because you don't sell tailored products anymore, you sell off-the-shelf solutions. This simple choice in business model, not understanding that it is a fundamental different way how you run the company, made them go bankrupt because they did not understand the difference. So they ended up with having different modules, and then they had a lot of people developing it, each module in a bespoke, tailored solution for even small companies. And I think we can all relate to that, that's how you go bust, because you will not make money. So it is in this process that if you make mistakes, if you think, ultimately you'll find your business model evil twin. It'll eat you from the inside because you will manage the company differently than actually what the business is about, than how you should be kind of competing. And let's see how that works kind of going forward. Because how do you get bankrupt over this? This graph, what this graph shows is that one of the confusions you find in the market, if the economy kind of goes down, we see more bankruptcies, which is quite, we find that logic. Now, actually, the real logic is a different one than what we think, because it's not the economy which is killing the companies, which is bankrupting the companies. The only thing which happens if demand is a bit in a slum, if interest goes up, if clients go to kind of other suppliers, what happens is that the flaws in the business model, basically, they show up early. They do not get disguised. So in a crisis, the saying goes, never waste a good crisis. In a crisis, all the vulnerabilities of a company will show. And they will show very strongly, much stronger, because they don't get disguised than in a normal economy. So when economy goes down, vulnerability shows and will be punished. And that's why you see in finding the vulnerabilities earlier in the process, there's a lot of value basically to it. So if we look here in what are Trojan horses? How do you actually kind of define within your company that you might have one? We found that there are actually four types where your business model might not be run properly, which might cause the real problems. And I will run you through it one by one by one. First is you have companies which actually are conglomerates, which have multiple business lines within one management. And each of these businesses actually requires a fundamental different way to manage your company. We call it entangled. You have multiple business models, but you don't know. For instance, let's consider the following in an entangled model. If you were to sell equipment to the offshore market in helping, then it's a one-off sale. So your drive would be to sell as much equipment as you can. If you were to rent ultimately the equipment, the barrier to use your product would be far less. However, it would require that you would have a continuous service machine serving. So if you end up by having a product which is sold and other people rent it at the same time within your company, I can guarantee you that the margins both for sales and for rental business will go down simultaneously. So you have two businesses, but you manage them basically as a single business. It does not work. Just by simply separating the two businesses, putting separate management on it, giving them targets, you will find that both businesses could flourish. If you don't identify one business model will eat the other, at least you will have two not functioning models basically in your house. The other way is when you think about an unadapted Trojan horse, which is a model which is not basically changing kind of to the market. I'll give you a very big example here. If you look at car manufacturers currently, their business model is very simple. They have integrated the car. They have the total supply chain under their control, from the design to all the technology they buy from their suppliers to the assembly, and then they bring it into the distribution channel, which is very much and strict under their control, although they are different entrepreneurs in it. Now, with the arrival of the electric car, the essential engineering for the OEMs, which is, they think at least, the propulsion part kind of the car or the interior, can be separated from a car. Because in an electric car, you have a battery, you have a platform, and then you can have the design. It can be different companies. In China, over the last 7 years, 92 new automotive companies have been established because they only take part of the new design of a car. You see, if you don't pay attention, Daimler, they basically spend $9 billion on making a choice that they want to do it all themselves. And now they're lagging behind. They're roughly 4 years behind their next competitor because they did not adapt. They thought that the internal combustion engine would last forever and they could fight off the electric vehicle. Look at the Mercedes B-Class. It's an excellent example where you see a sequence of decisions not adapting sufficiently to the market. The other one is the out of focus Trojan horse. Out of focus means that where you once thought that you would make money, you don't make money anymore with. A classic example on this one is McDonald's. Early in life, McDonald's made actually money by selling real estate. They were a real estate company. As you know, many retail ultimately is only about the rental income, which kind of people have. So if retail goes down, if revenues kind of go down, then your retail, the coverage of your retail space will go down and the value will go down. So if you don't know basically how to boost retail, how to go on and offline at the same time, how to basically take in also e-commerce, even if you are a physical retailer, you see that you miss part of the focus because business is shifting. It is out of focus, which you have. And then you have the overstretched Trojan horse, which is you try to do too much beyond the competencies and the capabilities which you have in a company. You add new businesses to it, which you ultimately don't master, to make it very simple. Now, this all means that you need to have a good view of what is your business model. Let's move to the next page. Ultimately, I'm going to skip this example because I already gave you a few examples, and the way forward means that it is about identifying the business model of your business. How do you actually make money? How do the clients appreciate your value? Is it for a single service? Is it for a bespoke solution, a customized solution? Is it for mass? Are you going to make money basically by utilization, high utilization of factories because clients purchase your mass goods? It can all be the case. The question is, how do you actually make your money? We're always amazed that within companies who are in trouble, they cannot pinpoint ultimately how you make money. Which part of the business makes money and which part does not. Specifically, if you have multiple models basically in the house. The other one is strategies are considered linear. I gave you a linear process on how do you do strategy. In practice, they're all loops. You go back and forth and you challenge yourself again and again and again. And that's why strategy is not a linear process anymore. Go into the 80s and the 90s books of strategy formulation. Ultimately, if you go, they don't apply anymore. If you don't keep on the ball and kind of consider short loops, design sprints, if you like, it doesn't work anymore. The other problem is you get inundated with data. Internal within companies, we find that management gets so much data, and even AI doesn't help here, that you don't know what to look at. That any hypothesis how your business is doing, you can prove it's good, you can prove it's bad. So what are you really looking at? You need to know. You need to basically think and prove and find out. We'll come back to this. And then we find a lot that compliance is more important than entrepreneurship. Of course, compliance is key. You have to be compliant to the law. There is no disagreement. But it cannot be that compliance basically kills entrepreneurship. New ideas kind of going forward. And that is where the next one kind of comes in, when you have board dynamics, which complicate perspective, because there is a dynamic in the board, not about the business, but it's about the politics. So these 5 issues we find clutter the discussion to have within in a board of management a direction on how do you identify. We have a pure business model. We know where we make money. We know where we put the resources. We know where we don't make money, we can address it, we can let it go. And that simple analysis is typically hypothesis driven. You think about it and you try to prove the multitude of data which you have. Now on the next page, here you find like the five things. How do you kind of overcome the Trojan horse? We say try to prove the obvious. If somebody says, yes, it's obvious we make our money here in this part of the business, ask somebody to prove it, to really put the numbers, and ask the question, to what extent do you really make the money there? You find that the answer is typically enlightening. Second is define the real strategic issues. Don't follow linear or incremental thinking. The industry has done this, so in the next 5 years it will go up. Don't know. You can be disrupted. Which goes back into the last one, I'm going to make a jump, is invite people who think differently, who have different views, who might not even agree with you, not because you might believe them, but ultimately is they might give you different views. They might give you different kind of ideas. Same as in have clear KPIs and milestones, so you know where you're heading. And if you see a deviation, something might be up, which might pinpoint that your business is changing, kind of going forward. And the last one I already said, balance compliance with entrepreneurship and creativity. If somebody has a really good business idea, but there is a problem in the execution, go back to the entrepreneurship, or go back into kind of the setup, how you can accommodate this. Now this sounds typical consultant slide, I would almost say. So how do you do this in practice? Let's go to the next one, which will be the last one. We said there is a very simple thing you can do, which we call the Trojan stress test. You can stress test your own enterprise, irrespective if you're a big company, if you're a small company, it doesn't matter. And the first part of this is, which is on the left-hand side here, step one, part one, you define your business model. What is it actually? And the way to do it is you unbundle the company's activities. You make a long list. What do we actually do? Are they really different? Or are they like the same activities? Do they interact? Do we rent? Do we lease? Do we manufacture? Is it all of the above? Where do we make the money? Do we make the money in the factory, or is it on the financial engineering of the product? Do we make money by having many people in our shop, or do we make it by high margin and very kind of like customized services? Fundamental different business. And then in the step two, you define how do you create value for customers, which is not the price. It is, why do they appreciate your business? Why do they really appreciate it? And in industrial environments, it will be fundamentally different than consumers. But if you cannot pinpoint it, if you cannot put it in one bullet, in one sentence, as in, this is the core of my business, most likely there is value being wasted here. If you have defined your business model, you test the robustness. So what you do is you take external changes, see what your competition is doing, see what the market is doing, see what the legislator is doing, and say, how would it affect my business? Can I cope? Or can I not cope? Because you see that when the economy goes down, if you cannot cope, it basically kind of misery will rear its ugly head. It is about being upfront. That's why you need these people who will challenge you, not because they're right, because they might be right, basically, and you can test, can we really cope with this? And then you check the step 4. Is the reward we get, the returns, the profits you make, is it worth the risk? I'll give you an example on this one. I did a restructuring of a company who made gas turbines, actually, for power plants. And they were totally uncompetitive, but they didn't know. So what they do is they absorb the more technical, advanced engineering projects. So they put a gas turbine on a ship. Now a gas turbine turns about with 10,000 to 20,000 revs, basically a minute. That's pretty fast. If you put it on a ship, your bearings, ultimately they will wear. Nobody knew what the outcome was. They started to build whole power plants in India because they took the value of the construction. The real problem was, of course, they did not master all this business. So they went bankrupt because the real problem was the engineering was too expensive. It was not up to scale and they could not, and they hid it. So is there a balance between the risk and the reward? You can do high risk stuff, but then the return should be big because you need to pay for your failures. And this is what we said is there is a very simple tool where you can take a stress test kind of on your own organization to see if your model, if your business model is under control, if it is robust. And there's a lot more detail which we cannot talk about now, which is basically available, but it helps you to test the robustness. And then if economy goes down, you will be resilient. You can weather much longer than you think, because that's one of our other learnings. You can it takes much longer to bankrupt a very good company. It takes years. It takes years really to go down once you have it under control. If you take the next 2 pages, I think then I'll wrap up. I had the privilege of taking some time and put it on paper. So everybody who's interested in the details in all the business cases, because we put them in the book, but also how do you do a stress test? How does it work? The book is available, and always happy basically to talk about it because it's a topic really kind of close to the heart in identifying it early stage. So whether you're a company, whether you are basically a financier, all very relevant basically to get this view quickly on the company. And with that, I think I will hand over.
Fantastic. Let's stay for a second on this page to introduce this chapter. We have just heard about Trojan horses, meaning challenged business models. And this is an important theme to identify a potential crisis early, no doubt, but actually it is one among several themes of corporate distress or ways of identifying potential crisis early on, or as crises then continue to unfold. So now we are going to talk about symptoms of crisis and, when possible, actually early warning signals to watch out for. But first, let's set the scene, because a crisis, if we're honest, can be triggered at 3 levels. And reality is often it is a combination of the 3. So first level, well, this is an adverse macroeconomic situation. And it goes without saying that, let's take a recession as an example, will hit hard many companies. So we can see this just by looking around us and the devastating economic effect of the COVID crisis. And the second layer are sector dynamics. For example, this can relate to some of the disrupting forces, such as new technologies, changing customer behaviors, that, as we heard before, can make a business model obsolete or requires rethinking, tweaking the business models. But sector dynamics can be as well something as simple as sector cyclicality that can wreak havoc. Think, for example, construction. This is a highly cyclical industry, closely related to the overall economic activity. And in Saudi, for example, closely linked to the oil price, which in turn affects government spend on mega projects. And then there is the third level, which is the actual individual company level. And ultimately, regardless of macroeconomic context and sector dynamics, the simple truth is that some companies are better prepared than others to navigate through difficult times. And it is exactly this third lens, the individual company lens, that we are going to examine now with regards to red flags screaming crisis likely in the making. So let's move to the next page. Obviously, the more advanced the crisis, the more obvious the crisis becomes, and unfortunately, the less room to maneuver. I mean, a company in liquidity crisis with going concern at risks, well, if you allow the comparison, is a bit like a stage 3 cancer patient. Now, the real question is, if you were to take an X-ray of a company, just like you do when you're going to the doctor for a checkup, what are the symptoms to look out for, both in terms of financial and non-financial indicators? So let's jump to the next page. And here we have 5 examples of symptoms that can be often found. Now, some are more obvious. These are particularly the financial ones, like earnings, liquidity, balance sheet strength, all of which, truth be told, is you can see in the financial statements. And some less obvious, for example, a look at management. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, and we could add many other items. For example, the financing structure of a company itself, and that actually can give you a certain early warning signal. Let's take as an example, let's go back to construction, which is a cyclical industry. If you have a company that has an excessive leverage, a very high debt position compared to equity at the top of the economic cycle, well, chances are this company will be in a relatively worse or poor position to weather the crisis. Now, looking at those 5 examples here on this page, I think the most notable item missing is, however, shareholder issues and poor corporate governance. So let me give you just one example from our work. So we advised the client here in the region on a large transformation program. Now, there was one particular shareholder and board member that was always very supportive of the transformation, except when it came to revamping procurement. Why? Because his other businesses were a key supplier to the company. Now, this might be an extreme example of potential conflicts of interest and can only be observed from within the company. But in general, a weak board of directors can serve as an early warning signal. And just looking at the composition of the board of directors, for example, the share of independent board members, the profiles of the different members, can give important clues how well equipped is the board of directors to actually control the business. Now, having said that, let's go one by one through those 5 examples that are listed here, starting with management instability. And again, if we are honest, this theme is probably much broader, and we could as well label it strength of management team. Because yes, vacant key positions over extended periods of times and high fluctuations among top executives is a clear warning signal that something might be wrong, that a crisis might be brewing. And the beauty is that in many cases, this can be relatively easy observed from the outside. Now, such a situation actually triggers questions of why is this happening, which in turn can reveal deeper rooted issues. For example, toxic company culture that does simply not welcome outsiders and fresh thinking. The company might just lack the willingness to invest in the right resources, pay proper bonuses, or industry insiders, meaning people working within the industry, simply believe the company is on a downwards path because they see those signals in the market. Now, yet the broader issue is whether the management team actually has the right skills and whether there's as well a succession plan in place. And in many cases of a crisis in the making, and even more so in subsequent restructuring situations, a management review often reveals dramatic shortcomings in this respect. For example, as part of a turnaround assessment, we looked at the top 20 executives along 4 lenses: expertise, think technical know-how, financial acumen; leadership capabilities, think driving team performance, developing people; culture fit, think integrity, teamwork, and agility and growth potential. Now, what was the outcome of this assessment? Well, first of all, there was not a single superstar, but that was actually not the real issue. The real issue was that half of the executive team did simply not meet the bar. And it might very well have been that a stronger executive team might have well been able to avert the crisis in the first place. And there is no doubt that a stronger executive team would have probably had an easier time to actually get the company out of the crisis. Now, that is why the board of directors and the CEO are well advised to step back from time to time and have a closer look whether the management team is actually fit for purpose and how to ensure the right team going forward. Now, let's move to the next page, earnings. Now, deteriorating earnings and financial ratios are obviously reason for concern. Now, the problem here, and Renee alluded to that early in the first part, is financial performance is a lagging indicator. And even as companies observe deteriorating earnings, they often fail, unfortunately, to translate this into a deeper look into the root causes and do not take corrective actions early and decisively. And some of this might be related to an outdated business model, but there might be many other issues in the business. Now, often what we see is it goes back to a lack of visibility on non-financial indicators and what they mean for the business. And even if there is visibility, companies might just not make the connection and think ahead enough. So talking about lack of visibility, for example, how many companies in the B2B space really have a well-established approach to win-loss analysis for bids and really try to get to the bottom why they did not win certain projects or why they won others? And how many companies does the CEO pick up the telephone from time to time and calls his top 3 customers to get their thoughts on the company's strengths and weaknesses? Or let's take an example from our project work. So there's a steel producer here in the region. This steel producer had one customer, a large construction company, which accounted for almost 50% of sales. Now, all management knew it, all board knew it. Now, when this construction company, this key client started struggling, well, sales collapsed for the steel company, but the steel producer had no contingency plan in place, had not focused on nourishing relationships with other construction firms that could be potential clients, and lacked the sales team to quickly find new accounts. So the question is, or the question to ask is, whether management is really looking close enough at its business, and if it does, chances are that it can early identify potential signs of a crisis. Let's move on to deteriorating liquidity. This can be easily observed in the financial statement. So, to be honest, just one question I would like to highlight. When you take a given company, does it have a good and solid 3 months, 12 months, perhaps even 3-year cash flow and liquidity forecasting system in place? And if it does, are those insights generated from that system actually fed back in the business with a view to take corrective actions? If the answer is no, well, then the business is flying blind, and that's a bad signal. The next topic on our list, equity erosion. Now, I think this is quite self-explanatory and, to be honest, typically seen in advanced stages of crisis. So, by the time you see a significant equity erosion, you already have dug yourself a pretty deep hole. So I would suggest not to further explore this today, but move on quickly to financial engineering. Now, this is actually a very, very interesting area. And I think we, just reading the newspapers here and there, we all get very excited when, the next big scandal pops up of a company that seemed to be big and successful and flourishing. And suddenly all the numbers collapse. It happens everywhere in the world. It happens as well here in the region. And this is something that could be explored for hours. And some of this, let's call it creative financial engineering, can be easy to spot. But the truth is that in many cases, this might be rather well hidden and would require a deep audit to unearth. So the message here is that financial statements are not always the ultimate truth, and a closer look can sometimes unearth a very ugly truth. Now, this actually leads me to conclude this chapter, and I would like to leave you with one message. The essence for me here is the key to spot a crisis early is to have the right governance in place, have the right people, ensure good visibility on what is happening in the business and around it, and use all of this to take corrective actions early. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasan. Sorry, I had trouble getting my mic on. Assalamu alaikum, marhaba. How's everyone doing? Hope everyone's okay and ready for the last section of today, which is corporate governance during a restructuring. And I saw already a few questions asking about what about corporate governance? Well, we saved it for the last 30 minutes. So corporate governance is extremely important, and it's not just about people, but it's also about processes and systems that need to be put in place. And these are never more needed than during a restructuring to make sure that the outcomes that you expect are the outcomes you achieve. So let's dive into it. So good governance ensures diligent, successful collaboration, right? We need to generate the desired stability and longevity. And corporate governance includes many different parts of a business internally and externally. These include the board of directors, top management, committees, investors, and especially when you're undergoing a restructuring, that list of stakeholders just grows and grows to more and more external parties. The objectives of governance are very clear. They need to be an agent for key stakeholders. They need to influence the strategic, financial, and operational decisions, align and drive various elements and parts of the company, most importantly, intervene when needed, and take responsibility for execution and stability of the company. Strong governance is needed to weather the storm, and the storm is what you see here. When you find yourself in a restructuring, you suddenly find yourself not only reporting to your boss, reporting to your board, but you're suddenly reporting to the banks, to the press, to the auditors, to the regulators. Customers start asking questions, suppliers start asking questions, and a long list of advisors are asking questions. So this is the storm that most companies undergoing a restructuring find themselves in. And good governance structure, if implemented early on, makes sure that you actually go through such a change or through such a journey in a stable and structured manner. And stakeholder management is going to be key here to achieving success that you set out to achieve. What are ways to improve or enhance the corporate governance of a company? And these are obviously and necessarily done before or once you see these early warning signs, you need to start looking at ways to improve your corporate governance and then go through a restructuring if needed. There are 6 examples that we put here, and we'll go through each of them in a little more detail. The first being tightening and polishing the governance roles and responsibilities. Make sure that the people who are responsible know what they are responsible for. Make sure that there's a set process of making sure decisions are made and the right people are informed and the right actions are taken. The second thing is to increase the frequency of updates and meetings, but not to a level that becomes distracting, because at the end of the day, you need to operate as a company. So this needs to be carefully thought out and carefully planned, and the people attending need to be very much aware of what they are attending and what they expect out of their meetings. The third one is to create committees to address key pain points. Every company goes through a restructuring for different reasons or goes through a crisis for different reasons. Finding out what the key pain points and creating the right committees to address them is going to be a key success factor of restructuring. The fourth point is consider onboarding a chief restructuring officer. We'll go through this in a little bit more detail later and the benefits of having a CRO. The fifth is to another add-on to the CRO is a little less intrusive, which is onboarding independent directors to your board, which bring impartiality, expertise, and focus that you might need on the crisis journey. And lastly, and often very much overlooked, is to encourage your employees to step up and implement battlefield promotions and incentives when you least expect to be putting incentives and worrying more about cost cutting. So the first enhancement lever here is tighten and polish roles and responsibilities. You see on the left side here, so a lot of times when we walk into the companies and start asking questions about who's responsible for something, or who needs to take an action, or who needs to be consulted, you sometimes get the different answers for the same questions. And hence you see the left side here, which is a spider web of tasks and who's responsible for doing it. I mean, we once were in a project earlier on in the year where we found out that the CFO was actually the person who was making the hiring and firing and HR decisions in the company. And there's a clear, you know, a conflict there where the CFO is generally more interested in financial matters and would not probably be the right person doing these decisions. So often, more often than not, you find companies that evolve where certain positions increase in power, and then there's certain opaqueness as to how to actually get things done. The right side here is we see an example of a very simple matrix that is very simple to put together. And I encourage all companies who are in a crisis or not even in a crisis to really revisit how the decision or process map is done, and look at who is making the decisions, who are the various powers and roles, what authorities do they have, what activities should they be doing, and develop a matrix for each of your key activities at least, right, to ensure that the right people are doing the right things. The second thing is an increase in frequency of meetings and a non-distracted increase in frequency of meetings. This needs to be very carefully thought out. This needs to be planned. And people need to not meet for too long and not meet for too little. I know it sounds like you're asking for the impossible, but through actually going through such a frequency of meetings, you will develop the right rhythm. An example here is the cash committee. A lot of companies who are going through a restructuring sometimes find themselves really strapped for cash. There's a backlog of payments that they need to do. One thing that a company in that position could do is start doing a weekly cash committee where they invite the CEO, the CFO, the CRO, if there is, and certain department heads to meet for 30 to 60 minutes once every week and look at a standardized cash template where they see what payments do I need to make this week, what payments have I made last week, and what value have they returned to me, and how much cash and how much room do I have for the rest of the month. And you'd be surprised that a 30 to 60 minute meeting like this every week can really improve your handle on payments and receipts. This is something that could be prepared by the CFO or the finance team. And once you get into the rhythm of it, then you start getting really good control of your cash spending in this example. The third lever is to formulate committees. Now, certain companies might find that, you know, their key pain points and the reasons they're in a crisis is because of a situation in one of their geographies. For example, we were working with, you know, a hospital, healthcare basically platform, and they found out that most of their problems were coming from a certain country within the region. So one thing they did there is to formulate a committee that would meet and have an agenda and have a clear work plan and a timeline to disengage as well, which is very important, to focus on this issue. And this committee can include not just people internally within the company who are experts or have good knowledge of this problem, but could also invite external experts to come and sit in this committee, meet frequently, work through their work plan, and really take the issue head on, rather than continuing in the normal business setup that you have and try to fight a problem that's not normal. The fourth lever, and a very, you know, recent, but it's been like a decade or two that people are really coming to terms with the concept of a CRO. And the chief restructuring officer is not just a person, it's actually a concept, and it could be a team, it could be professionals that come in and assume this role. And what does it mean? What does a CRO mean? It's not an off-the-shelf product. It's basically tailored to your company, to your situation. They require the support of all stakeholders, and their role will evolve and adapt over time according to the needs of your company. The main role here is to facilitate. They draw up on their experiences, they act as a gateway to other expertise, and they facilitate all the different stakeholders and advisors and all the new stakeholders as you're going through a crisis. What are the benefits of a CRO? They're independent. They have no agenda. They have no links to customers, no suppliers. They will always give an objective view. They have a focused effort. You hire them for the role, and that's all they will do, which is going to be very beneficial when you need extra hands at a time of crisis. They are temporary and only a complementary measure, meaning that they're only there for this problem. And it allows management to focus on their role. Sometimes you find that managers are doing work that they shouldn't be doing, that's taken away from their current responsibilities, and then you have this double-edged sword where you're trying to fight a problem and creating a new one at the same time. Having a CRO takes that load off management. And obviously they should have deep knowledge in the restructuring process and the players needed to achieve the success that you want. There are obvious potential drawbacks of a CRO. There's an impact on management morale of bringing in a new person and crowning him as a savior. And also there are costs involved with a CRO. However, getting a good CRO will be able to mitigate all these problems as they've been in this position before and they've done exactly what you're asking them to do. Building more on that, and Lever 5 kind of takes a step back at a less intrusive sort of a position of a CRO, and something that we've alluded to earlier with Renee and Sasan is the role of independent directors. And independent directors are very beneficial to have on your board. They're impartial and objective. They focus on the depth of perspective about your industry. They have expertise where you might be missing expertise. And they're key to resolve any conflicts that you might have with the directors and management. And finally, they mentor and share their network when you need it the most. A real life example of an independent director where I was working on a project for a fund that's there are a lot of questions about who controls payment and how are we making sure that we are paying the right people the right time. And a simple answer to that was hiring an independent director who came in and had a super authority on all of the banks and had really no ties to suppliers and customers. And I think that's an issue that was brought up earlier by Sasan. Sometimes you're going to a company and you find that, you know, one of your managers is actually has a relationship with one of your customers or one of your suppliers, and sometimes there's you know, subjectivity there. There's more preferential treatment for them, which might not be very beneficial in a restructuring, trying to get back on your feet. So one thing to do there is to bring an independent director who's completely impartial and have them be the super authority, have them be given reason and logic to make a decision rather than build on any agenda that might be there. Finally, uplifting your employee morale when they need it the most is a very important angle that most companies going through restructuring must consider. We need to encourage your employees to step up and take on responsibilities more than ever when you're undergoing restructuring. I will continue. Secondly, and when you least expect to be investing in your business and you're more focused on cost cutting and finding cash where in places, you should actually start thinking about incentivizing your employees through various rewards to really step up during a time of need. And a great way to do this is battlefield promotions, and I've seen it happen. We're 6 months into a restructuring, the team morale is really down. People are finding it very hard to wake up and come to work because, you know, they don't know the direction the company's going and if it's going to be alive the next day. Well, you know what really wakes everyone up and brings them back to reality? Promoting someone in the company, your colleague, for doing good work at a time of, you know, complete distress. It's a really shock to the system, a very positive shock to the system. It really wakes people up, encourages them, and motivates them to work hard because they see reward and result immediately. So this is something really to consider when you're going through a restructuring. And finally, you know, push your talent pool, extract the best performance, and really look for high achievers during these times. I think with that, we can wrap up the corporate governance section and leave the floor now for questions. Thank you, everyone.
I'd like to thank the speakers for their excellent presentation. It was truly special. We will leave the remaining time to answer the questions we have. Let's keep it brief so we can answer as many questions as we can. We only have 15 minutes. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A button, if we can read them. You have a question. Do you agree with the business continuity management program for companies and organizations need to include pandemics such as COVID-19 in risk assessment scenarios?
Sasan, you take this one?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, obviously, like business continuity management programs and overall, you know, risk management programs are critical and should be set up as broad as possible. Now, there are, well, not always, but from time to time there might be exceptional events such as COVID-19 that, you know, I think is fair to say very few, if any, actually anticipated. But beyond that individual event, the type of event that, you know, could create a disruption to supply chains, or that could suddenly bring sales to a stop, yes, absolutely, there should be a look at how resilient are actually the different parts of our organization. And the event that could cause that could be a pandemic, it could be a war, it could be many things, all very low probability events. But yes, the resilience of an organization to disruption can be and should be addressed.
Yeah, fully agree. Perhaps I can take the second question. Altman Z, one of the favorites. If I can remember my statistics right, then it has a over 80% reliability within 12 months time frame. If you take the classic Altman Z, and if you go into like a 2-year predictive forecast, it tumbles basically into, I think it was below 35%, but I'm taking the numbers out of my memory some time ago. Basically what it says is, the answer is short-term, yes, there is a certain value to using these scores and these ratings. If you look at many of the credit rating agencies, if you look at kind of the banks, they all have different and their own risk classifications. Now, if you would make a comparison of quite a few of these techniques, then you will find that their predictive quality kind of going forward is limited to 12, maximum 18 months. And then statistically, they are less relevant. Because it was the slide which we showed you that a lot of the financials actually, they predict what the history has been going forward. So it's a linear extrapolation of what's happening and basically how it would develop. Nevertheless, it is a very interesting tool because it might pinpoint basically where there are like risks in the model. Will it help you to really pinpoint where are the risks, what are the root causes, not the symptoms? Then they are less useful. So we use them. If you want to make a scan of an industry, it just helps. Does it help to really give you insight in the root causes? Less so.
I can take the next question, or Sasan, if you want.
Oh, go ahead.
Recently, we're seeing certain actions towards management and being responsible on debts and collection. When is the proper timeline to outlook such aspects by board of directors? So I presume the question is, when is the right time to have the board of directors step in and help out with debts and collections? And this goes back to the governance that we're talking about. And the first lever here actually is you to polish the roles and responsibilities of people in the organization. I think it's a very good exercise to do, to look at your key activities, which include collecting on debts and other receivables, and look at who should be responsible for a task, who should be informed for a task, who you should consult for a task, and follow that RACI matrix. I think once you're able to go through that exercise and really understand who has the power and authority and who has the expertise and who has the execution capability to do each and individual task, and sit down along with the team, your management team, and invite your board of directors and run this exercise with them, you'll always be able to identify the best route for an activity to take to be able to achieve the quickest and best outcome for you. And I think only through that exercise, you'll be able to know who should be doing what and when.
Thank you.
Next question.
Perhaps I can take the next question. Is, have you developed a specific module to assess how healthy the entity is? Now, different entities might have very different businesses in it. So is there one tool which does it all? The answer is, I'm afraid not. If you would look at the stress test which we introduced, it will provide you the tools to have the discussion, basically, how healthy is the business? Can you define it? And if you mirror it with what both Safan and Said said, in having the competencies, the management, the independent directors kind of available, or other kind of people who kind of understand the industry and really challenge, as in the resilience of the business model, you will find that it is actually pretty useful, even if you cannot kind of quantify everything, because not all statistics are available. If the logic, that for me was the learning of the 5 years of research, if the logic in the business model cannot be pinpointed, then basically the business is at peril. Then the business needs to be kind of like reviewed kind of going forward. So logic for me is a very clear indicator, or lack of logic, or if you have a strong logic, it works the other way around, basically that there is a sound business. But have it challenged, because it's quite easy to have a convincing logic for yourself. But when people basically, experts, don't challenge it, it might work the other way around. So I would go for logic. Stress test in the book can help going forward.
Yeah, I'll read the next question in English. What are the alternatives for companies undergoing a crisis? Sasan, or
I'm actually not sure if I properly understand the question. What are the alternatives?
What are the alternative? What are alternative plans for companies that are undergoing a crisis? What are their options?
Perhaps I can take a first cut at it. The options typically have 3 levels, which you can basically kind of see and which you can divide. The first level of option is in the operations. Do you have an operational problem? Too much waste? Is your cost price too high? Is that kind of really kind of the root cause of the lack of competitiveness? Then you have an operational problem. Typically easier to fix because you can take cost out, or you can have a new process coming in. The second aspect of your business is you have a client problem. The client don't appreciate the value less because a new competitor is in town, or a new alternative is there, or people spend their money differently. It can be businesses too, by the way. That goes one step deeper, because you have to rethink what is the value you offer to a client. Think about a construction company. If you are building basically pretty standard houses and somebody comes with a modular concept and basically whacks off 20 or 15% of the cost price, you need to redesign fully your process on how you develop houses. That goes deep if the client has a different. The third layer is not cost, is not your offering to the market. It's more fundamental, where you say, look, the activities which I have in my firm, are they actually a product, or is it really a firm? Is it an enterprise? Or is it a good complement for somebody else? And then you talk about the portfolio game, where activities in your company might have a different owner, where they might flourish, where they might take benefit of technological development of somebody else, because the technology platform has shifted. And then you go into the portfolio game. So there are very different ways, different alternatives and levels which you have to look into if you really have to kind of restructure a company.
Yeah, and perhaps in very simple terms, at the end of the day, you can think about it as, what are my strategic levers, what are my operational levers, and what are my financial levers in terms of re-engineering the company. Perhaps I take the next question. What should we do in case of lack of confidence in the financial statements and thus the correctness of financial ratios? And perhaps, first of all, I think it's fair to say that by far the vast majority of firms actually has proper financials, and there is no misconduct in that sense. Now, yes, there are some cases, and I think the answer to that question actually depends in whose shoes you are, right? Are you in the management shoes and you have the feeling that in some part of the business something smells fishy? Or are you at the board level? Or are you potentially a bank that has financed this business? And the room for maneuver and how easy it is and what to do, I think will differ by that. And obviously, if you're inside the company, for example, the board, there is an audit committee. It has all the power to review what is happening financially in the company. It has the option to engage additional external advisors to dig into some areas if considered relevant. I think the more the difficult part is obviously if you sit on the outside of the company, and the company actually has properly audited financials, and you still believe, well, perhaps there's something fishy. And if you have a good relationship with the company, it might be time just to have a friendly, informal chat. Sometimes that goes actually a very far way. And and at the end of the day, look, you outside, it will be accepted. The company is really going down the drain, and you have the power to push a forensic audit because you're one of the key financiers. It will be very difficult. Perhaps it's then time to think about options of walking away, or at least reducing the exposure that you have going forward.
I just wanted to add, Sasan, and this reminds me of my first job. I was a corporate banker, and the first thing, and the one thing I had to do was basically write these credit analysis reports on companies and submit them to the credit committee so they can assess whether the company is good enough to get a loan from the bank or not. So on my first week, I got a company, and I looked at their financials. I made these fancy charts, fancy ratios, put them all in a document. I went to my boss and I said, here's the credit analysis of this company. And he looks at it and he goes, where'd you get these numbers, and how did you come about this? I'm like, they're financial statements, I got them, and it looks good. And he's like, did you go and actually see the inventory? Did you go and actually meet the CFO? Did you go and see the process that they're making these companies? And I said, no. And he's like, well, there's only so much you can tell from a piece of paper that someone wrote and stamped and gave it to you. But trust me, you'll find a lot more when you actually visit the company. And he was absolutely right. Once you go to the company and actually, they say they have 10 million worth of inventory, and you open the warehouse and you see just, a few boxes. Well, that's quite telling, right? There's always ways. It depends, like Sasan said, on which side of the table you're sitting. But if you're a banker and the company needs money from you, then it's okay to knock the door and go into the warehouse. It's okay to call the CFO and say, can I sit with you for 5 minutes and really understand, how you run this business? There's always, you need to check the tangibles as much as you can whenever you can. And that's just that's a funny story that I thought about here. The next question is there a set standard or framework for governance in a company? I could take out the simple answer is no. There is no set standard. However, there are recognized, methodologies, or there are certain things that you always need to be aware of. But like we went through in our chapter, you need to always revisit your governance, and your governance fits very much into the business model, which fits very much is the second step of the spectrum that we saw with Renee. And depending on where your company is and what is it adapting to and what changes it's undergoing, you need to revisit your business model constantly every year and look at certain aspects of it, including your governance, right? For a certain period of time, you might need an independent director to look at XYZ. And then once that's resolved, then there's no point on keeping that independent director on board. And then this is how you should be looking at corporate governance. There is no plug and play. There is an assessment that you need to sit down and look at what am I being faced with, who are my stakeholders, and what are the key things that I need to look at, and build your committees and your governance structure around your business and the environment that it operates in. Would RB be kind enough to give a copy of Trojan Horse's Decline book to bankruptcy trustees? I think we can speak with the Bankruptcy Commission after. But Renee, I think.
Yeah. No, I like the second question, which is as a gift. We will make sure we will do two things. We will send you a few copies. We will send you like the presentation of the essence of it, and it would be our pleasure to discuss it further with you.
Okay. What would you advise in case it is too late to avoid bankruptcy and our bankruptcy has been confirmed? What are the correct procedures to avoid large debts and losses? Well, I mean, if you've reached the bankruptcy, you're generally undergoing a process, it's a regulatory process, meaning there are certain activities that you need to do and follow with the regulator, and to reach the outcome, and that usually involves the efforts of management. There's a credit committee that's put together by your lenders. There's also the regulator to make sure that there's a plan and that you're following the plan, and then you need to continue that process. And most probably you will need to hire help, independent consultants, to take you through this plan, to realize what's best for the company that state that it's in. The next question is: هل يختلف التعامل في الشركات الخدمات المقارنة مع الشركات الأخرى التجارية? Is there a difference in the way we look at services companies versus other commercial companies?
Yeah, I think we can. That has a very kind of clear answer. If you would go into the elements which make up a business model, and I won't go over kind of all the theory here. You'll find that the way the models run is fundamentally different. Simply put, if you run a company which makes bolts and nuts, then you make money by having high utilization in your factory. You can go left, right, nice and center, but essence is you need high utilization in your company. If you are a services company, which could be tax advisor, then ultimately you will live by the quality kind of your advice which you give, which is a one-to-one service pledge. If I buy a nut or a bolt, I can assess the quality before I buy it. I cannot assess the quality of your advice before I get it, and then I already have to pay. So the fundamental different way of how do you market, how do you sell, how do you create value for a services company is different than from a manufacturing, than a production company. From a company selling goods is fundamentally different than from a company leasing goods. From a company funding projects. Project business is fundamentally different, etc., etc. So yes, you really have to kind of go in depth, specifically kind of how does the industry work, and even within industry, you will find very, very many differences of models which you cannot mix, which mix very badly, which you need to know. Example I gave you: if you sell standard software versus very kind of like tailored bespoke software, it'll have an impact on your cost price of roughly 40% different if you need more software engineers or not. If you have more 30% more cost price basically in your after sales network, it is a fundamental different setup of your company. This is where doing some benchmarking, talking to other people how they've set it up, gives you also a very good idea of the basic setup, and the cost structure which you have is fit for purpose for the different businesses which you are, because they are quite fundamentally different. The last one is the book is unavailable in Amazon, any other publisher. If it's anonymous, but if you leave your details basically with the Bankruptcy Commission, with the trustees, then we will make sure you get a book.
I think all questions have been answered.
Okay, we must wrap up. Thank you so much, our partner at Ronald Berger, Mr. Sassan, Mr. Renee, Mr. Saeed. Thank you very much for your fruitful presentation. Our dear audience, to conclude, we would like to thank you for attending and listening to this symposium. Thank you for your attention and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.